In 1907, a wealthy aristocrat named Henry Child moved his two young children to a secluded mansion in Virginia, unaware that within its walls lay a terrifying secret. But when the door to the forbidden south corridor was locked and his children began to hear strange whispers in the night, one question remained. What was he hiding, and why did he forbid them to go near it? Stay tuned to uncover the dark truth that haunts this mansion. It was 1907, and the fog-laden streets of Royal Leamington Spa, England, were still reeling from the echoes of the industrial age. Henry Child, a man of wealth, stature, and haunted eyes, had decided it was time to leave everything behind. His wife had died years earlier, a death that seemed to drain the light out of his soul. For years, he had mourned in silence, locking himself away from the world while his two children, Marianne 11 and Jonathan 9, were cared for by their kind but no-nonsense nanny Edith. One rainy afternoon, with little explanation, Henry announced to the children that they were moving to America. Not London, not Paris, not the bustling cities they might have imagined, but Virginia, a place they had only ever heard of in books. Marianne had stared at her father that day, her young mind filled with questions she dared not ask. "Why Virginia, father?" she finally ventured. Henry, lost in thought, didn't answer. He simply walked away, leaving her with the uneasy sense that his decision wasn't just about starting over. It was about leaving something behind. The journey to America was long and somber. The ship creaked against the Atlantic waves, its wooden decks soaked with rain as if even the heavens mourned their departure. Henry rarely spoke, spending most of his time on the upper deck, staring into the endless gray horizon. Marianne clung to Edith, who, in her warm and practical way, tried to keep the children entertained. But even Edith couldn't shake the feeling that something about this move was unnatural. When they finally arrived in Virginia, the sun was shining, but the warmth of the day did little to dispel the eerie feeling that enveloped the family. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its dark stone walls rising like a fortress against the backdrop of thick woods. It was beautiful in a way that felt wrong. The children, however, were too young to notice the foreboding aura of their new home. To them, the sprawling estate was a playground. The gardens were lush and endless, the hallways so vast they echoed with every sound. Marianne and Jonathan would run through the corridors, their laughter filling the once empty house. But there was one part of the mansion that seemed different. It was the south corridor. Unlike the rest of the house, which was filled with light and life, the south corridor was always dim, no matter the time of day. The air felt colder there, and the sound of their footsteps seemed to vanish into the silence. Marianne noticed it first. "Why is it so quiet here?" she whispered to Jonathan one afternoon. Jonathan, ever the daring one, shrugged. "Let's find out." The two siblings ventured down the hallway, their footsteps cautious, their laughter subdued. At the very end of the corridor stood a door, an old, heavy thing made of dark oak, its surface etched with strange, swirling patterns. Unlike the other doors in the house, which were plain and functional, this one seemed ancient, as though it had been there long before the mansion was built. Marianne reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingertips brushed the wood, a chill shot up her arm. She yanked her hand back, startled. "Don't touch it," Jonathan said, his voice unusually serious. Marianne frowned. "Why not?" "I don't know," he replied, his gaze fixed on the door. "It feels bad." For a while, they left it alone, but the door lingered in Marianne's mind like a dark shadow. She couldn't stop thinking about it. One evening, during dinner, she finally asked, "Father," she began hesitantly, "what's behind the door in the south corridor?" The effect was immediate. Henry froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His face darkened, and for the first time in her life, Marianne saw something in her father's eyes she had never seen before. Fear. He set his fork down slowly, his movements deliberate. "You are never to go near that door," he said, his voice low and firm. "Do you understand me?" Marianne blinked, startled by the intensity of his tone. "But do you understand?" he repeated, louder this time, his voice sharp enough to make Jonathan flinch. "Yes, father," she whispered, bowing her head. The rest of the meal passed in silence, the once warm dining room now heavy with unspoken tension. That night, Marianne lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound of crickets drifted through the open window, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. Why was he so angry? What was behind that door? Her curiosity grew stronger with each passing day. Whenever she and Jonathan played in the house, she found herself drawn to the south corridor. She would stand at the edge, staring at the door from afar, her imagination running wild. What could be behind it? A treasure? A secret room? Something dangerous? Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You are never to go near that door." But the more she thought about it, the less she could resist. Something about that door didn't just frighten her. It called to her. Days passed, but the door to the south corridor seemed to haunt Marianne. It wasn't just a physical barrier anymore. It had become a part of her thoughts. Every time she ran through the house, she couldn't help but glance toward it, her eyes drawn to the mysterious oak door at the end of the dim hallway. The house was full of echoes, but this one felt different, like a part of it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Henry had made it clear. They were not to go near that door, not to ask questions, not to wonder about what was behind it. Marianne had always been a curious child, but now that curiosity had begun to gnaw at her like a constant whisper in the back of her mind. What was so dangerous about that door? She couldn't shake the feeling that her father was hiding something terrible. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was late, far later than Marianne usually stayed up. The wind howled outside the mansion, rattling the old windows. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, the sound of footsteps broke the silence of the house. Marianne froze, her heart thumping in her chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet but failing. Her first thought was that it was her father. But why would he be walking around at this hour, especially after all he had said about staying away from the south corridor? She slipped out of her bed, careful not to wake Jonathan, and quietly padded down the hall in her bare feet. As she neared the corner, she saw a flicker of light coming from beneath the door of the south corridor. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. It had to be. The heavy footsteps, the lantern, everything matched. But as she crept closer, a chill ran through her. The air felt colder now, as though the mansion itself was exhaling something dark, something that didn't belong. Marianne's hand hovered over the doorknob, but she pulled it back just as quickly. She had been told never to go near this door. The question burned in her mind again. What was so dangerous about this room? Her curiosity won, and with a deep breath, she pushed the door open just a crack. It was enough to see her father standing in the middle of the room, his back turned to her. He was muttering something under his breath, words that didn't make sense. But then she heard a voice, a deep, guttural voice that wasn't Henry's. The hairs on the back of Marianne's neck stood up. She couldn't see where the voice came from, but it was unmistakable. Duo propter parietem mortem. Marianne's blood ran cold. She had been schooled in Latin, and she knew exactly what that phrase meant. You are hastening to death. Her legs went weak, and her breath caught in her throat. Who was he talking to? It couldn't be her father. This wasn't his voice. This was something else, something unnatural. Marianne felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, as the voice continued, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the very walls of the mansion. Who was in that room with him? She had to find out. She couldn't turn back now. She had already crossed the line. The door, left ajar, creaked louder as she pushed it open further, stepping inside. The room was dark, save for a few candles flickering around an intricate circle drawn on the floor in what looked like old chalk. Strange symbols were etched into the walls. Symbols that Marian had never seen before, but seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with an unexplainable tension, as though the room itself was alive. Her father's figure stood motionless in the center of the circle, his eyes closed, chanting in a language that sent a shiver down her spine. He was so deep in the trance that he didn't notice her at first. But then, something shifted. The figure at the edge of the circle shifted, and Marianne's heart skipped a beat. She had felt it before. The presence. It was there, standing just beyond the reach of her vision. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just a fleeting sense of dread. It was real. No, no, no. Marianne whispered, stepping backwards slowly, her foot hitting a creaky floorboard with a sharp crack. Henry spun around, his eyes wide with panic, and caught sight of her. His face, normally so composed and strong, was now twisted with something dark and desperate. "Marianne," he shouted, "what are you doing here? What did you see?" His voice cracked, full of fear, full of something else. Before she could speak, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped drastically, and she could feel the presence, the thing drawing nearer. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It didn't move like any person she had ever seen. There was something unnatural about the way the shadows seemed to bend around it. "Father, what is that?" Marianne managed to choke out, her voice trembling. But before Henry could answer, the shadow lunged. It wasn't like a normal person. It was an entity, a dark, fluid shape that seemed to move as one with the shadows themselves. Henry stepped in front of her, his body trembling as he tried to shield her from whatever it was. But it was already too late. The shadow rushed at him, and he screamed, a sound that chilled Marianne to the core. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Marianne remembered before running out of the room was the sound of her father's voice, his final plea, "Stay away from the south corridor." The room was suffocating, thick with a cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Marianne's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She ran blindly, down the dark corridor, not looking back, not daring to. Every step was a desperate attempt to escape the nightmare that had just unfolded. The house, once a place of wonder and exploration, now felt like a labyrinth. The walls seemed to close in on her as she sprinted past empty rooms, her feet making frantic, hollow echoes in the dark. The mansion had transformed into something else, a living, breathing entity that was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Stay away from the south corridor. But what had she seen? What was that thing? A part of her wanted to run straight to Jonathan, to tell him what had happened, to beg for comfort. But another part of her, something darker, something primal, knew she couldn't. Not yet. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was lurking in the shadows of this place. She stopped at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. Her pulse still raced, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not when she was this close. She glanced down the corridor. The door to the south corridor loomed like a mouth of darkness, waiting for her to return. She shouldn't go back. The rational part of her screamed to leave, to run out of the house and never look back. But the other part, the part that had always craved answers, dragged her forward. The mansion groaned around her, the floorboards creaking as if the house itself was alive, disapproving of her every move. Every inch of her screamed to stop, but she didn't. As she approached the door, the air grew heavier. The shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive, as if the very walls were watching her. Marianne reached for the door, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold metal handle. It was locked. The door that had once been ajar was now sealed shut, as if the house itself had closed it off. Marianne pushed harder, twisting the handle with all her strength, her heart beating faster. What was behind that door? What could it possibly be that her father had feared so much? She knew now that she couldn't run. The answers lay behind that door, and she would stop at nothing to find them. With one final push, the door gave way, creaking open just enough for her to slip inside. The room was different now. Darker, colder, and filled with an oppressive silence. The circle on the floor was still there, its strange symbols glowing faintly in the low light of the candles. But the air in the room had changed. It was no longer just a room. It was a place of something unnatural, something far older than the mansion itself. Then she saw it, him, Henry, her father. He was kneeling in the center of the circle, but this time he wasn't chanting. He was silent, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead as if he was no longer aware of the world around him. His once vibrant face was pale, drawn, almost lifeless. The man she had known was gone. The darkness that had consumed him now seeped into the very walls of the room. Marianne couldn't breathe. The shadows twisted and coiled like serpents around him, suffocating him. There was something wrong. And then, as if sensing her presence, he spoke. His voice was soft, but it wasn't his own. It was a whisper, a low growl that sent chills running down her spine. It has already begun. Marianne recoiled, stepping back. But her feet felt heavy, as though the floor beneath her had turned to mud. What has begun? She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She was paralyzed, unable to move. From the corner of the room, the shadows began to stir. Slowly, a shape began to take form. A tall, gaunt figure, its skin pale and almost translucent, its eyes hollow voids. It was not human, not even close. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. Its mouth opened, and a low hiss filled the air. Marianne's mind raced. She had seen this thing before, hadn't she? In the walls, in the corners of the house. It had always been there, lurking in the darkness, watching, waiting for something. But what? What did it want with her father? No one leaves, the creature whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that rattled her bones. No one ever leaves. Marianne's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She had to get out. She had to find Jonathan, get him out of the house before it was too late. But the door was gone. She had entered through it, but now it was simply gone. The mansion had swallowed them whole. Then, a sudden flash of light filled the room. For a brief moment, everything froze. The shadows, the figure, even her father. The light was blinding, and Marianne shielded her eyes, but she could still hear the hissing, the whispering voices, the thing that wasn't human. It was like the house was fighting to keep them inside. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the foundation itself was alive, shifting, closing off every possible escape. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, her hands gripping the edges of the now vanished door. The figure's mouth opened wider, its teeth gleaming in the dim light, and it took a step forward, stretching toward her. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissipated into the shadows. The room was still, and for a split second, she could have sworn she heard a voice, her father's voice, calling her name. Marianne? It was faint, distant, and filled with desperation. But it was enough. Marianne turned and ran. She didn't look back. The mansion was alive now, shifting around her as though it knew she was trying to escape. She reached the stairs, her feet pounding against the steps, her lungs burning with each breath. She had to find Jonathan, had to warn him. But the house, no, the thing that had consumed her father, was closing in. As the cold, foggy night enveloped the mansion, Marianne's heart raced in her chest. The old mansion creaked and groaned, almost as though it was alive, whispering its secrets to those willing to listen. She had felt it, the presence, just beyond the walls, the unseen force that had been haunting them since they first arrived. But tonight, something was different. Something was waiting for her. Marianne, now a grown woman, clutched the frayed edges of the blanket, her body trembling as she recalled the events that followed that night. The door to the south corridor, the one her father had strictly forbidden them from even approaching, had finally been unlocked. The very same door that had held the key to all their unanswered questions. The door that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy whenever they dared to stand before it. As she lay there in her bed, barely breathing, she heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor, slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was walking toward her. She held her breath, hoping beyond hope that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. With trembling hands, she slid out of bed, her bare feet making no sound as she tiptoed to the doorway. The air was thick, heavy with something dark and foreboding. She peered out into the hallway, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There, at the end of the south corridor, was her father, standing motionless. But his face was not the same. His eyes were dark, hollow, as if he had become something else, something not entirely human. "Father?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly and without a word, walked toward the door to the forbidden room. A cold dread washed over her, but Marian couldn't stop herself. She followed, creeping behind him. She watched as her father reached the door. But something was different now. The air shimmered with an almost tangible force, and she felt it in the pit of her stomach. The presence of something malevolent. Her heart pounded in her ears as he reached for the door, turning the handle. "Stop!" she cried, her voice finally breaking free of her paralyzing fear. Her father froze, his back still turned, but his voice, when he spoke, was not his own. It was deep guttural, filled with an unearthly echo that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come, Marian," the voice growled. "It's too late now." Before she could react, the door flew open with a violent gust, and the mansion seemed to hold its breath. What was behind that door? What had been locked away all these years? The room beyond was a nightmare. The walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness, and in the center stood an altar, its surface stained with something dark and ancient. And there, in the shadows, was something that could only be described as otherworldly, a presence that chilled her to her core. Her father, now fully transformed, stepped into the room, his body moving like a puppet on invisible strings. And with that, the air around them thickened, suffocating. The darkness was closing in, swallowing everything in its path. Marian didn't know what happened next. One moment she was standing there, terrified, and the next, everything went silent. The darkness, the presence, her father, all of it vanished. When she woke up, she found herself outside the mansion, the sun just beginning to rise. She was alone. Her father, Jonathan. Everyone was gone. The mansion, as if it had never existed, was nothing more than an abandoned ruin. The south corridor was no more. And the memories? They faded into nothing, as though they had never happened. But Marianne knew. She knew that whatever had happened in that house, it was not over. It was never over. Conclusion and call to action. As she sat there, reflecting on the horror that had unfolded, she knew that the story was far from finished. Was her father lost to something darker? What happened to Jonathan? Was the mansion truly gone? Or had it just moved on to claim another soul? There are mysteries out there, lurking, waiting for us to uncover them. But some doors, like the one in the south corridor, are better left locked. But what do you think? Was the darkness that Marian witnessed something supernatural? Or was it something even worse? An ancient curse that can never be escaped? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story left you breathless and craving more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like the video to stay up to date with our latest spine-chilling tales. Comment below and tell us if you think Marianne's story is truly over, or if the mansion is still waiting for its next victim. And if you want to hear more about the terrifying things that lurk in the shadows, click the link to watch the second part of this saga, where we dive even deeper into the mystery. Remember, some stories never die. They just wait for the right moment to return. Thanks for watching and stay safe, or maybe don't.